every single person I met with was incredibly nice to me. In fact, from day one until 3 months later, when I got to the Arctic coast, in my journal, I tried to keep the names of everyone who showed me some act of kindness. A couple of people bought me Tim Hortons along the way. And I had, by the end of my journey, about 150 names written down in my diary of different people.
Mr. Adam Shoalts, back from expedition. How's your settling back into normal human life?
Oh, it's going pretty well. My last journey was 3 months. So it was, by the end of those 3 months, just the simple luxuries I was missing. I was actually really looking forward to just being able to read a book because I'm a big reader, and 3 months without having a lot of time to read because I was always traveling left me with a real desire to get back to my books and a nice cup of tea and just having a roof over my head. So I'm settling in quite nicely after 3 months of adventuring.
Can you take us through the route that you took? You started on Lake Erie, which is one of the, well, I guess it's right here. One of the Great Lakes between Canada and the US. So where did you start exactly?
So I started on the north shore of Lake Erie at Long Point, which anyone looking at a map of the Great Lakes, you can immediately pick out Long Point because it's a giant peninsula that juts almost 40 kilometers right out into Lake Erie. I mean, it's massive. There's nothing else like it in Lake Erie anyways. I have personal connections to that area. I lived right beside Long Point for 2.5 years in Norfolk County. And anyone who's ever been in that area knows that it's essentially the bird watching capital of Canada. Every hardcore bird watcher in Canada, they make a pilgrimage there every spring because you can see more birds right there at Long Point than anywhere else in Canada. Literally over 400 different species pass through there on the spring migration, and then they come back in the fall. And many of these birds, if you're a bird, are pretty exciting because they come from as far away as the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, and they pass over Long Point, which is a sort of a stopover for them, and then they go north to the Arctic. And for that reason, Long Point is sometimes described as the only true wilderness left in southern Ontario because the whole thing is protected. It's a national wildlife refuge. So it's thousands of acres of marshland and swamp and sort of coastal habitat where these birds congregate. And living there, I'd be paddling in the lake, and I would sometimes be looking out and I would see these birds and I would recognize them from my journeys in Canada's Arctic. And immediately that would make me nostalgic and get me dreaming. And it was actually one day I was at my house, which was maybe a kilometer or two from the lake, less than 2 kilometers. And I was looking out my porch window and I saw peregrine falcon, which I recognized immediately because I see quite a few peregrine falcons whenever I'm in the Arctic. And it was just sort of flying across the cornfield. This was in March or April. And I thought, oh man, that's amazing because I know those falcons are migrating right now north to the Arctic where they'll make their nests, lay their eggs, and then in the fall they'll migrate south. And I thought almost immediately, wouldn't it be awesome to follow that bird? So if you look up, and you can do it on Google in just a matter of seconds, peregrine falcon migration routes, some of them actually go right from Long Point, Lake Erie, all the way up to the Torngat Mountains. And the Torngat Mountains are about as spectacular and majestic a place as you could ever imagine. They're an Arctic mountain range in northern Labrador in Quebec, right on Ungava Bay, which I can pick out on your map behind you there. That big, yeah, you know where it is, right there, just due south of Baffin Island, the Torngat Mountains. So that's where those falcons are going, up to this like otherworldly mountain range that seems like something out of an ancient legend. And I'm like, wow, I just sort of glanced at my map of Canada and I'm like, well, where there's a will, there's a way. With portage, you can pretty much get from anywhere you want from one point in North America to another. And almost immediately, the idea entered my head of why not follow the falcon? Get my backpack, get my canoe, put it into Lake Erie, and paddle north thousands of kilometers all the way to the Arctic coast, up to the Torngat Mountains where those falcons are nesting. So that was it. It happened very spontaneously. So just as I was getting ready to go, COVID happens. So this was 2 years ago, right? March. Oh. And COVID happened. And I was like, okay. Everything is put on hold. And as you know, 2 weeks turned into 2 years. And 2 years passed and things changed. I became a father in those 2 years. And I just sort of thought, well, it's a dream that I'm never going to realize. I just put it out of my mind. It was a cool idea, but I'm never actually going to do it. I have other responsibilities now. And COVID kind of put it all on ice. But it was actually my wife who said to me, you should go. It's now or never. It's going to haunt you forever if you don't actually try. So this past spring, as soon as the ice had melted in April, I saw the falcons, just like anyone can. If you go down to Long Point, they're easy to spot. And I put my canoe in the water on April 24th, right at Long Point there, and set off paddling. And my mission was go about 3,400 kilometers all the way up to the Arctic coast and the Torngats and see if you can spot a falcon up there. And you only live once, so I'm going to give it my best shot. And you asked about the route. The route was remarkably straightforward. Compared to a number of years ago when I did my solo journey across Canada's Arctic, which was almost 4,000 kilometers, that route was really complex. It took a lot of studying maps and satellite images to just sort of stitch together hypothetical connections between lakes and going between watersheds. This one is remarkably straightforward. You can pretty much just pick it out on a map of Canada. So I started right on Lake Erie. I followed the north shore of Lake Erie all the way from Long Point, through Norfolk County, Haldimand County, all the way over to Port Colborne, and then finally to Fort Erie, where the Peace Bridge is, connecting Canada to Buffalo, New York. I went right under the Peace Bridge in my canoe and down the Niagara River, past Navy Island, and as close as I dared to the brink of the Horseshoe Falls. I was edging right along the shoreline. The current is picking up, and when I could see the hydro intake, so you would never actually get to the brink in a canoe there. There's a big hydro intake. That's when I was really feeling my heart pounding, and I got out there. So at Chippewa, just above the falls there, I got out and I portaged my canoe. I planned this ahead of time, so I had from Canadian Tire a set of wheels for putting a canoe or kayak on, and I have to say, they worked marvelously. Like the best $75 I ever spent. If you balanced a canoe just right, you can push it easy. So it was about a 13-kilometer portage around Niagara Falls and the Whirlpool Rapids, the gorge, and I put in on the other side.
People have run the Niagara Gorge in canoes. Nolan Whitesell ran the Niagara Gorge in a canoe years ago. Why didn't you run it?
Oh, yeah, that sounds extremely prudent and easy. Of course I should have done that. I was actually stopped by a Parks police officer when I was approaching the brink because he thought that's exactly what I was going to do, that I was a daredevil, a stunt guy trying to make a video for YouTube. And I assured him that that was about the exact opposite and that I would be entirely happy if I managed to get through the day without going into the rapids. So I portaged around them and I put in at Queenston, just at the foot of the gorge there. Paddled the rest of the way down the Niagara River, rounded Niagara-on-the-Lake, and then I followed the north shore of Lake Ontario. Technically, it would have been shorter and faster if I had actually crossed over to the U.S., because if you look at the map, the Canadian shore is a lot longer. I had to go all the way around Hamilton, Burlington, Mississauga that way. But I wanted to keep things all in Canada, so I followed the north shore. Took me around underneath the Burlington Skyway. I had an interesting night camping under the Skyway because the weather turned very stormy there, as it often does, because it's right at the end of the lake. So you have big swells coming across that vast expanse of water, and the waves just pinned me down there. I could have used some of your skills that night.
Oh, really?
No, I was fine. But it was a little bit, for a guy who spends almost all his time out in the wilderness, in the woods, this was an entirely different set of circumstances to find myself in. I am not a city person at all. I mean, I live in the countryside, and paddling my canoe into the biggest urban area in Canada, the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, it was more nerve-wracking for me than any of the wilderness travel. I really didn't know what to expect. And I knew, this is almost a 100-kilometer stretch of urban landscape. And if there are big waves on Lake Ontario, it might take me a number of days to get through here. Where am I going to camp? So that was a challenge. Where am I going to set my tent up?
Where did you camp?
Well, I camped in a few places, and I'm not even really sure if I should disclose the exact locations because I'm sorry to say, I have permission all of the time. But actually, wherever I could get permission, I did ask for permission. And there was a couple of nights, once near the Bay of Quinte and another time on Lake Erie where the weather was good. The lake was calm, smooth as glass. So I paddled for 15 and one day, 16 hours just because I knew how stormy the Great Lakes can be. I mean, they can sink huge 100-foot long ships, so they can easily swamp my 15-foot canoe. So when weather was good, I would paddle as late as I could. Several times I would be paddling after dark. And I would have stopped sooner, but so much of the Great Lakes shoreline now, at least on Erie and Ontario, is unnatural. It's actually man-made barriers and breakwalls. Everyone worried about the erosion. So you have like steel breakwalls and concrete breakwalls. And sometimes I'd be paddling for 2 hours and I'd be like, there's nowhere I can land my canoe. And there was a couple times where it's like, okay, it's too dark. It's not safe. I'm going to get hit by something. There was one time where I was paddling in the dark on Lake Erie and I almost smoked this old concrete pier that was going out in the water. It was a little bit beneath the water line. It was an old dock from like probably the 1950s or something. And I stopped at that point. I'm like, okay, it's too dark. I can't keep going paddling in the dark. And there was nowhere to camp. I was outside this city of Port Colborne. And so I actually went and knocked on someone's door. I walked around to the front of their house because I wasn't going to go knock on their back window and scare them, have them call the police on me. But I knocked on the front door and said, look, I'm really sorry to bother you. My name's Adam, and I'm canoeing from Lake Erie to the Arctic. I have nowhere else to go. I can't paddle any farther tonight. It's too dark. Would you be okay if I just camped in your backyard down on the lake shore there? And every time I resorted to something like that, everyone was incredibly nice. Everyone gave me permission. Not only did they give me permission, then I had to like say, no, it's really okay. You don't need to make me dinner. If you let me sleep here for 6 hours, I'll be gone, I promise, by 4. So I had to do that a few times. In Hamilton, under the Burlington Skyway, if you look on satellite images, you can actually see on Google Earth, there's a little patch of forest there. And this forest was a godsend to me. I camped in that forest, and it wasn't actually bad at all. It was nice and sandy. It would have been quite beautiful. But at first I thought, well, this must be like the hangout for like the local kids or something. They come out here and build tree forts and things. And then later on, I realized as I was inspecting it, I'm like, this is actually kind of substantial. I think it's more of a homeless encampment I've come into here. So I spent a few nights like that. There was another night in Montreal where it was the same situation. I just simply couldn't go on any further. Darkness was coming. I camped under the Jacques Cartier Bridge, which is right near the old port of Montreal. That, again, turned out to be one of my favorite campsites. I had a beautiful sleep there, nice and solid. I was actually by these shipping containers, and there's a bridge where the Jacques Cartier Bridge comes from the city of Montreal. It goes into this little island and then over to the mainland. And on the island, there's like an amusement park. But this was still early in the year, and it didn't look like the amusement park was open. And it was kind of fenced off. So nobody could get there unless you went by water, but nobody was going under the Jacques Cartier Bridge. So I had a really nice, comfortable campsite, just kind of among the staghorn sumac and the willows down on the shoreline there. There were a few other times like that where I had to figure something out, where am I going to sleep in the southern part of my route. And there were many people I met along the way. Again, outside of Montreal and Quebec, there was a horrible storm that sprung up, and I had nowhere to go. And there was a campground there, but the campground was not really operational because it was still early in the season. I don't think they opened until maybe the long weekend in May. But there was one trailer with like a light on, and I knocked on that trailer and said, like, because I didn't want to trespass and, get in trouble. Mm-hmm. So I said, like, would it be okay if I just set my tent up here? And it was this nice, sweet old French-Canadian lady, and she ended up she was thrilled to have me camp there, and she made me French onion soup, and she brought me cheese and all this sort of nice stuff. Every single person I met with was incredibly nice to me. In fact, from day one until 3 months later when I got to the Arctic coast, in my journal, I tried to keep the names of everyone who showed me some act of kindness. A couple of people bought me Tim Hortons along the way, and I had, by the end of my journey, about 150 names written down in my diary of different people. Sometimes it was just a simple word where they would give me encouragement, or locals who knew something about the route ahead, telling me, there's a good site up there where you could camp, or be careful, there's the hydro dam just past Cornwall there, this kind of stuff. And that was very different than any of the wilderness expeditions that are my normal fare, paddling through heavily populated areas where there was this whole different dynamic. Mm-hmm. And there were a whole other set of challenges and hazards that came with paddling on the St. Lawrence Seaway in the Great Lakes, where there's a lot of commercial shipping traffic, locks and hydro dams and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that was all part of the journey.
Okay. So you paddled all the way down into Quebec, and then you did a big left-hand turn to cut across essentially the eastern part of the entire eastern part of Canada.
Yes, yeah. So once I got through the GTA, it was along the North Shore, around the Bay of Quinte to Kingston. And then from Kingston, it was down the St. Lawrence River, through the Thousand Islands. Around day 24, I left Ontario, I entered into Quebec, past Montreal, past Trois-Rivières, past Quebec City, and then out onto the estuary of the St. Lawrence where it gets salty and you have tides. And from there, I turned north up the Laurentian Mountains all the way up to Labrador, from Labrador across the Labrador Plateau, and eventually...
Just for my own amusement, what river did you go up across Labrador, or up through Quebec to Labrador?
Up through Quebec. So I traveled mostly on foot through that section. The reason was every route I would research is no longer possible because they've built massive hydroelectric dams on some of the biggest hydroelectric dams in the world on those rivers, and you can't paddle them as a result, at least not safely or legally. So I hiked my way north from there, and then when I got around the hydro dams, paddled the rest of the way. There was still a hydro dam I couldn't avoid. I had to go around it in my canoe. It was fortunately a fairly small one. And then once I got to Labrador, that was my final resupply, because what I had done is essentially mailed my packages of anything I would need, like granola bars and freeze-dried meals and extra socks and boxers, to Canada Post. And Canada Post actually has this little system that anyone can sign up for free. They call it Flex Delivery. And they advertise it as people, riding your bike or your motorcycle across Canada, mail yourself packages to Canada Post and pick them up, and we'll hold them for 2 weeks, and you can mail up to 50 pounds to a post office. So I selected about 4 or 5 of these post offices that were right along the water, along the St. Lawrence or elsewhere, one in Labrador, and had mailed myself my packages that I would need there. The one in Labrador is in Labrador City, which is not really a city. It's about 8,000 people. And it's right close to the water there, which was my final pickup spot. And from there, it was about another month to go all the way out to the coast of Ungava Bay, through some rivers and lakes, over the height of land, eventually to the George River watershed, down a few tributaries to the George River. Then the George River is like a 500-kilometer almost straight shot down to the coast, the salt water there, and a detour on foot that I did to the Torngat Mountains, which come almost down to the banks of the George River. So that was the route in the nutshell. There is a map that gives people a better sense on my website if they want to see it.
Okay. Yeah, I saw some of the photos that you posted after the trip of the George River part of the trip. And it's funny, people don't really think of Quebec or Labrador as Arctic territory because it's not as far north as, say, the Northwest Territories or the Yukon. But just climatically, it's very definitely in the Arctic.
Yeah, that was one of the things I discovered, is that a lot of Canadians don't really have a very definite sense of where the Arctic actually is. Mm-hmm. I thought it was kind of obvious that Ungava Bay is like quintessentially Arctic. I mean, anyone going there, even if you were not an ecologist or geographer, you would immediately realize you were in the Arctic just by the fact that you're on the tundra, where there are polar bears and beluga whales and all the other characteristic Arctic flora and fauna. There's permafrost, there are no trees. But yeah, a lot of people seem to think that, that there's no Arctic in there, despite the fact that you could, again, just in 5 seconds, Google an ecosystem map of Canada and see that the Torngats are indeed part of the Arctic ecosystem. And culturally, they're part of the Arctic as well. All of the communities along the Ungava coast are Inuit communities. So yeah, that's all part of the Arctic. I actually explain this in my book, Beyond the Trees, where I talk about, what is actually the Arctic? What does that word mean? What's its origin? Is there a universal definition of what qualifies as Arctic? No, there's not. Different geographers define it different ways. One of the more sort of popular conceptions is that, it's just anything north of the Arctic Circle. But talk to any ecologist, they'll quickly explain that definition is really arbitrary and doesn't make any sense, because nature doesn't follow such a perfect line. You could be well north of the Arctic Circle in somewhere like Sweden or Norway or Alaska or the Yukon, and you could have an ecology that's not much different than Northern Ontario. And I've seen that in the Northern Yukon, where you're above the Arctic Circle, but you still have, big spruce trees and tamaracks and blueberries and everything that you would find in, say, Temagami. And on the flip side, you can be well south of the Arctic Circle, especially around, say, Hudson's Bay, which acts as kind of a giant freezer. And you're in a landscape that looks identical to the high Arctic, to the Arctic Islands, because the conditions there, the climate is much colder and everything is characteristically Arctic. So really the only definition of the Arctic that makes any sense is something based on the ecology. And ecology doesn't follow a perfect straight line. It kind of zigzags up and down. And I mean, you can look up the Federal Ministry of Natural Resources and they have maps showing you roughly where it goes around the top of the world.
It really does seem that in your writing and in your exploration that you're very attuned to the ecology of the area. It's something that you really try to bring out in your writing and even on things like your Instagram posts. That it really adds a whole layer of depth to the experience.
Yeah, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I love plants and trees. And I mean, if I didn't love plants and trees as much as I do, I probably wouldn't do these long journeys because that's something that's every day is exciting to me, is to look at the plants, the mushrooms, the wildflowers, the trees, if there are any, that I'm encountering on one of my canoe journeys. And I try to document all of them. And when I write my books, I don't just say, I camped under a tree. I'll say I camped under a beautiful white oak that was probably 300 to 400 years old on the island in the St. Lawrence off of Cornwall. And I'll describe, the lichens or the mushrooms that I come across. Oh, look at this. It's a larch bolete. I'm going to throw this in my pot. And I talk about the differences. I mean, when you get to the Arctic tundra, there's lots of edible berries. Sometimes it's like a buffet of berries, but many of them are extremely tiny, like Arctic blueberries, which are like these tiny plants hugging the Arctic tundra. And I remember I was doing an expedition last year in Alberta, in southern Alberta, and having just been in the Arctic, I was like amazed, blown away by the size of the blueberry bushes. I was like, man, these are like, they should be in the county fair. They could win a blue ribbon. Mm-hmm. These are the biggest blueberry bushes I've ever seen. So that was actually one of the motivations for my journey. I was like, when it gets time to actually sit down and write this book, I'm going to have a lot of fun describing the different ecosystems, because I went all the way from the lush Carolinian forest, which you only find in Canada along the north shore of Lake Erie, which has all sorts of characteristic trees like tulip trees that you don't see anywhere else, Kentucky coffee trees, anywhere else in Canada anyways, pawpaws. And, from there, transition into the next ecosystem, which is what most ecologists call the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, which has a lot of broadleaf trees like oaks and maples and ash, but also more red and white pine and eastern white cedar. And then from there, going into the boreal forest, which is the biggest forest in the world. And mostly in that landscape, you've got a lot of black spruce and white spruce. And then from there, you're transitioning really into the subarctic, where the big trees get fewer and far between, but you still have tree cover. And it's a lot of stunted tamarack and mostly black spruce. You've got willows and not a whole lot else, alders. And then from there, the final ecosystem is the Arctic itself, where you're in the land of the permafrost, where trees can't take root, and it's just windswept open plains known as tundra. So I thought, this would be really cool to actually see this in real time unfold, and just sort of, subtly, day by day, week by week, I'm witnessing the change in the landscape. And I learned a lot of things that I didn't know before. And I sometimes realized, like, some of these maps that you look up in your geography book aren't entirely accurate. I was surprised how far some of the broadleaf forests continued in Quebec, beyond Quebec City. And as someone who's also interested in history, this was fascinating to me, because I was like, okay, now this makes sense. This is where Samuel du Champlain in the 1620s is establishing the first farm in Canada. And I can totally see, why he would choose this site. It's not exactly as I pictured it. I was thinking it's going to be a boreal forest here with a lot of spruce and pine. But in fact, no, this is all like sugar maple, oak and ash. Yeah, this makes perfect sense. Right. Why he wanted this site here.
Nice rich soil.
Rich soil. And you can see all of the attractions. They're going to be tapping these maple trees in March. The oak is perfect, firewood, everything is good here. They're going to be building their houses. Yeah. So that was another interesting aspect of the journey, seeing the different environments, the different landscapes, and the cultural adaptations to each one, and how they influence the history of these areas.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned almost as in passing that you'd become a father during COVID, and your boy is 18 months old now?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. How were you staying in up? I imagine that for the southern part of your journey, you were able to stay in touch with your family fairly easily.
Well, yes, fairly easy compared to anyone who lived historically.
Yeah.
Still a little bit of challenges. So yeah, for the first half of my route or so, there were cell towers. So I could use a smartphone just like anyone else could, with one limitation, which is because I was camping, I had no way to charge the phone other than with my solar panel. I have one of those Goal Zero ones about the size of a notebook. And
Yeah.
it actually turned out the spring of 2022 was like a historically wet spring in Eastern Canada. In fact, Environment Canada issued multiple heavy rainfall warnings, and there was a 2-week stretch of rain, and it was incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, I just looked at the sky and I couldn't believe it. So I had to ration my battery for that reason. I mean, I know that the companies say that their solar panels work even in the rain, but in my experience, they really need full sun to charge anything. And in any case, I mean, you're not going to leave your cell phone out in the rain.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit about that beforehand. So I was under some battery life limitations, but I tried to stay in touch with my family as much as I could on the southern section of my route. Then there were big stretches as I went north where there was no cell towers, there's no cell coverage. That's a lot harder to stay in touch for. I had a satellite phone, which of course doesn't work with a cell tower, works with a satellite orbiting the Earth. But I don't know what your experience has been with them. Mine never really seemed to work that well, where the call constantly drops. And they also go through, I probably knew this from the past, but maybe being more eager than ever before now that I'm a parent, to actually use the satellite phone. I was amazed by how quickly they go through battery life.
Yeah.
I remember I had mine fully charged in like one phone call, which couldn't have been more than 25 minutes. It was like half the battery had gone in that one phone call.
It makes sense if you got to send a radio signal all the way up to outer space. Well, not outer space, but low Earth orbit, as opposed to the cell tower a couple miles away. It's got to be more powerful. It's probably really good for the brain to have this massive source of radio signals going right beside your ear. But we're just going to ignore that part of it.
Yeah, don't tell me that. Now I'm going to be more hesitant to use one. But yeah, no, the reason I dwell upon it is it's an interesting dynamic of doing these kind of wilderness journeys where you can still be entirely cut off from the rest of the world. You don't know what's happening in the news. You don't know what's happening at home. And there's no easy way to get in touch with anyone. And I think a lot of people who haven't been out in wilderness, they sort of don't fully realize that, or they take it for granted that their phone would actually work. And then they discover that you actually don't have to go anywhere near that far. You can just be in like Algonquin Park and your phone won't work. Yeah. And the reason I sort of dwell upon it is that, it's possible that in the near future, relative near future, that will no longer be the case. I think the technology companies are working to try to make your cell phone work anywhere, right? By sending more and more satellites up into the Earth. Into the atmosphere. So it's interesting that, possibly in the relatively near future, the entire dynamic of traveling in remote places might feel very differently.
Yeah. We'll certainly lose something and we'll gain something. I mean, we'll gain a measure of safety, we'll gain a measure of staying in touch with loved ones. But I think the isolation and, not knowing, for example, you're paddling across some northern lake. I found myself wondering, like, if World War III had broken out yesterday, would I know about it? And the answer is, probably not. I'm pretty far from any places that the missiles would land. And then what happens then? Am I going to stay out here forever? Yeah, your mind starts finding ways to occupy its time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose if let's say that Elon Musk's his Starlink system succeeds, and now you can watch your YouTube videos at the South Pole. But I suppose if you were determined enough, you could simply, as an act of willpower, say, I'm just not going to bring a phone at all. And I'm going to get that old-fashioned experience of just being completely unplugged. And to a certain extent, through my journey through southern Canada sort of felt like that, because I was rationing my battery life, and I was only using my phone to contact my family, essentially. So I had no idea what was actually happening in the world, and I consumed no news whatsoever. And I remember, a month and a half in, when I had a conversation with someone in the middle of a portage, I actually asked permission from a property owner. I said, I have to get around this this hydro dam or some such obstacle. Can I cut through your backyard because it'll save a lot? And I had a conversation with him, and I remember asking, he said something about the war in Ukraine, and I said, that's still going on. And it was just sort of like, wow, I've completely lost touch with everything that's happening, and it's surprisingly refreshing. I feel like it's much less stressful not knowing about anything and just being completely consumed with your task. Because like my whole world was bound up in this canoe journey that I was doing, and it was actually remarkably stress-free. Not really worrying about anything else other than what the weather is doing in my immediate area. Are these waves going to die down this afternoon and I can paddle again? Is the sun going to come out? And I just didn't think of anything outside of that, really. And it was, surprisingly stress-free. And I just think it's going to be interesting when, expeditions are going to some of the most isolated places geographically on the planet, but they're completely plugged into everything that's still happening through social media and news media and all of that, because they can just as easily stay in touch as not stay in touch.
I could be wrong, but didn't Shackleton set off for the South Pole before World War I started? And by the time he came back, 3 years later, like the world was just aflame and millions of people had died, and it was a completely different world than the one he had exited. And
absolutely. He left right at the start of World War I. He almost stopped, and he had to get special permission to leave England because the war had been declared. It had broken out. And I think it was actually Winston Churchill, who was in the Admiralty office, who gave him the order, said, I think it was just one word, proceed, that he could go on. But of course, they had no inkling that the war was going to last as long as they did. They thought it was going to be like, it will be over by Christmas. And you can imagine the shock that when they came back, they realized, the world they'd left no longer existed and that it had been completely transformed. And those expeditions are totally other magnitude. Going away for years makes 3 months seem like a picnic.
So I wanted to run a bunch of questions past you because I get a whole bunch of questions from people who are very interested in the outdoor expeditioning, but there's questions that come up again and again. So I thought I'd get your feedback on, like, what's your number one tip for, say, staying safe when you're in the wilderness?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. And I would honestly have to say my number one tip for staying safe is not any piece of gear, not even an emergency communication system. I think that in some ways that could potentially make you more reckless if it gives you a false sense of security and you start taking risks you really shouldn't take. So I would say the number one thing you can stay safe, it is your mind. It's what's up here. You have to be smart and responsible. And above all, you have to err on the side of caution. People who describe themselves as like adrenaline junkies, they make me nervous and I don't want to be in a canoe with them. I think you have to be really cautious. Is there going to be lightning tonight? If there is, you better not be camping on any sort of high ground or by a big exposed rock face. Are you absolutely sure you can get around that big point in the lake? Maybe it's better because of the waves and the wind just to portage, cut across the point rather than try to round it. These rapids, maybe if it's a Sunday afternoon back home with your friends and it's a warm July day, you can run them. But out here, water's cold, you're very isolated, you're tired because you've been paddling for 7-8 hours before you even got to this point. Your canoe's pretty heavily loaded. I say don't go through them. Go along the shore. And that's kind of like talking to myself on my journey. I would always say, things like slow and steady wins the race. Adam, let's take this one step at a time. Keep your eye on the prize. It's getting to the end. You got to be careful here. Be cautious. And I think that if you have that mindset where you're almost like the anti-adrenaline junkie, be slow, be careful. The risks are relatively low. And traveling by canoe in the wilderness or hiking is a pastime that's very enjoyable. And it's something that almost anyone can do of any background, any age, and really take a lot of pleasure out of it and really have a lot of stress come off their shoulders because they're doing something that doesn't have to be crazy and dangerous. The George River, I didn't really know this because I'd focused most of my efforts on the earlier part of my route, but apparently a lot of canoeists have drowned on this river. I read online that 9 canoeists have drowned in relatively recent years alone on the George River. Apparently 7 in a single incident. And
how difficult a river is it?
Well, that's just it. So I was like, wow, I know its reputation, that it has this fearsome reputation that you could easily die there because of the cold conditions and just many, 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 many dozens of rapids. There's just tons and tons of rapids on this river. But I would have to say that it's not a particularly dangerous river as far as northern rivers go. I mean, it's not exactly a novice river either, but there are certainly far more dangerous rivers. Like on my journey across the Arctic, I would say the Hanbury River is far more treacherous than the George River. And I think that's partly why it's this mental side that I'm talking about when I say that your mind is your best asset in terms of staying safe. And I could see exactly why so many people have drowned trying to canoe the George River, which is there are numerous rapids on it that are completely easy and they're fun. I mean, you could take like a summer camp down them with no trouble. But therein lies the danger. If you spend all day and even a week paddling relatively easy rapids, it lulls you into this false sense of security where you start to think, oh, I'm actually pretty good. I'm getting the hang of this whitewater thing. Here's another long stretch of rapids. Let's nail it. We're almost at the end. This will be a nice send off for the journey. Great end to the trip, right? Because they're all pretty much harmless. They're just big waves. You can plow through them. But sometimes hidden in those long stretches would be something really nasty. It's like, yeah, there's a 3-kilometer stretch of rapids, 95% of which is pretty easy and straightforward, but buried towards the end there is a dangerous ledge where there's a really dangerous undertow or there's a big drop and you can't see it until you're right over it. And the shoreline is often treacherous there where there's no easy way to actually get out of the river because of rocks and things. So I could see how, people just got overconfident and thought everything's going to be a breeze. We can just keep going. And even me, knowing the dangers and knowing people had drowned there, it's so easy in those circumstances when the black flies are bad and you just want to get a few miles further along where you're like, I think I can do it. I think I can get through this next set of rapids. And rapids, I don't know about your experience, but to me, they always seem smaller from the outside than when you get into the heart of them. Yeah. It's like, wow, those waves are a lot bigger now that I'm actually in them than they looked from on shore way over there. So it's really easy to make a mistake. But if you can resist that temptation, if you can make the smart decision, then the risks are quite minimal and you really have nothing to fear so long as you don't do anything stupid and put yourself in harm's way. So that's why I always say, your best asset, it is your mind. Just, never get panicky, never make impulsive decisions. Just be smart, take it slow. It's not a race. And you'll be fine. I did that on the Great Lakes. I mean, Lake Erie, my most dangerous moments on the entire journey were within the first week on Lake Erie, especially towards the end of Lake Erie. There are just such large swells and the weather was cold. This past April, and there was actually snow squalls around April 26th, 27th when I was off Port Coburn, and I had to get around the breakwall there. And that was a whole nother dimension, all the human-made objects. Some of the breakwalls on the Great Lakes, as I discovered, you can't avoid them. They extend like a kilometer offshore, they're just like a straight concrete barrier going a kilometer offshore where they have a canal for the ships. And you can't, I was like, well, maybe just go over them. Well, no, you can't go over them. They're just concrete blocks. They're vertical that rise straight out of the water. So you have to paddle in your canoe all the way around these breakwalls. And, the swells would be bad. There'd be huge waves. They could easily do damage to me. Water's freezing cold. So sometimes I'd be like, okay, well, I'm just going to find the most comfortable spot I can on this Lake Erie beach and spend all day here, getting caught up on my notebook until this wind dies down, and then I'll continue. So I did that a few times where I would just be spending a lot more time on shore than I really would have liked. But I was like, I'm just going to play it safe. If I have to get up at 4 a.m. when the wind has died, I'll do that and paddle until 10, and then I'll stop at 10 in the morning. And if I have to wait on shore for another 6 hours until the evening, I'll continue in the evening. So all along both Erie and Ontario, I was frequently windbound on shore because I didn't want to risk it going out.
Well, on those big lakes, it really is like Gordon Lightfoot said, the legend lives on from the Chippewa down about the big lake they call Gitchagumi. Like if that can sink the bloody Edmund Fitzgerald, it can sink you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the waves are massive.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. I know you and I have different approaches. But this is your podcast. What advice would you give to people about food?
Okay, well, now I want to hear your approach to food. I don't remember. I mean, I know we must do things a
I
little
do a
bit.
lot of dehydrating and specialty stuff and try and vary the diet, and I don't like freeze-dried food. But
Well,
I
okay,
know that you have...
so I used to do all that. I bought a dehydrator like
Mhm.
15 years ago, and I would go to a lot more effort to dehydrating my meals. But at that time, I was doing mostly relatively 2 to 3 week
Yeah.
expeditions. So I could put more effort into like, I'm thinking out, this is what I want to eat for these 2 weeks. But then as I became explorer in residence of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, it was like my time was always under such pressure in between. It'd be like, oh, I've got to go away for 2 months,
Yeah.
3 months. And I'd be like, I don't have any time to prep in terms of food because dehydrating can be very time consuming. So I would just, I'm going to go to the outdoor store and buy a selection of freeze-dried meals and eat these. Of course, they're not nearly as tasty or probably as nutritious as a result, but it's hard to beat them in terms of just the convenience factor of going into the store and getting them. And once I had funding, in the beginning, I don't think I ever actually tasted a freeze-dried meal until I was 27.
Hmm.
I couldn't afford them because they're relatively expensive. So until I actually got funding and sponsors, I never would buy any of that expensive stuff. I was always, if I had to go to a store, it was like, no frills and stuff like that. But we'll leave that aside for a second. And if you're planning a big expedition, I'm very minimalist in terms of the food I pack. There's definitely not a whole lot of variety or luxury in what I'm eating. It's really just to get me through. So on this journey, I lost a lot of weight. I was thin as a rail by the end. I still haven't gained back the weight from this journey. I was eating about 9 bars a day, which was a mix of, energy bars and Cliff bars, granola bars, fruit bars. And then I would have one freeze-dried meal. And that was it. And I had a few extra stuff like a bag of almonds. I had a little bit of thing of dried mangoes, but that was like a luxury. Like once in 2 weeks, I could eat this thing. This was towards the end of my journey. If I could get food anywhere else, I would. Like when I was off the GTA, there was someone who was talking to me because I was windbound. And she was like, well, can I buy you Tim Hortons? Like, or is that against the rules? And I was like, no, there are no rules. Like, it's just a personal journey. I'm just here. I'm like, if you're going to buy me Tim Hortons, I will happily eat it. So there was a couple of times where I'd be like, yes, absolutely. Like if you want to, give me some food, I'm not going to say no to the food. If you bring me food, I will eat anything that comes across. I ate a lot of fish on my journey because I was so hungry and it was so easy to catch big brook trout, like 7-8 pound brook trout. So I ate as many of those as I could and as many wild berries as I could. But there wasn't a whole lot of ripe berries that early in the year. It was July. Up in the Torngats, I found that the blueberries had already gone ripe up above the tree line, right at the higher elevations. And lingonberries, the nice thing about them, which some people also call mountain cranberries, you can find a ton of those from the previous
Last
year.
Yeah.
And they taste better anyways that way because they've been frozen. So I was eating those as well. But there wasn't a whole lot of food. I mean, this one, I wanted to travel light. And the reason I wanted to travel light, well, a couple of reasons. Just less to carry when I was portaging, which makes things a heck of a lot easier. And also because I had my son at home, who was 15 months or so when I left, I really didn't want to drag out this journey like I might have done 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I might have traveled the route at 4 months. But this one, I was like 3 months. And because of that, I'm not going to bring...
Paddle.
Yeah, partly that, putting in longer days and just not stopping in the middle of the day if you come to a gorgeous campsite, right? Like it's beautiful, enjoy it and go on. So because of that, I didn't carry any extra food. On most of my other expeditions, I'm like, well, anything could happen, right? I need a lot of extra food. And every expedition I've ever done, I end it with a ton of surplus food that I never even touched, right? So I'm hauling all like pounds and pounds of extra stuff I never actually need. This one, I didn't do that, right? I went to the bare essentials. I was like, I'm not going to bring a stove, right? I'm sure I can find willow to burn or driftwood. I don't need to bring a little camp stove. Just 2 pairs of clothes, barely anything. In fact, I did something I'd never done before, which is I knew from the past, like, what am I going to do for the water? Am I going to bring neoprene? How am I going to stay? Am I going to wear a dry suit, waders? How am I going to keep myself warm? But from having done so many northern expeditions, I'm like, man, half the time I just end up sweating, or this stuff gets wet anyways, or it gets punctured. And I kind of knew, like from other people and from my own experiences, that I could probably just wear like beach shoes, like water shoes, and be fine. So that's actually what I did on my journey for the northern part. I simply wore shoes and walked through the water, often in my boxers. And even though it was cold, it wasn't a problem because I was always moving. And I'm like, well, as soon as I'm done wading through the water, I just change back into my dry clothes. Yeah. And that saved me a lot of packing and weight, not bringing anything like that. And I was fine. It wasn't an issue. So I just traveled really light in terms of everything, food, like very few luxuries.
One more thing about food. How many calories do you figure you were consuming per day, and what was your body weight to start with?
Okay, well, I'll answer the latter part first. Again, I don't own a scale, so I have no idea. I simply haven't weighed myself in years, but I know I lost a lot of weight. I was having I was losing weight right from the start, even in Southern Ontario, where you might be like, well, you're in Southern Ontario. Why not just go to McDonald's? Well, there's a good reason why I couldn't do that, which is, I have a very positive view of humanity, but still you'd be taking quite a risk of just leaving your canoe and all of your gear unattended and hiking to a McDonald's or something, right? I couldn't leave my canoe unattended. Wherever that canoe is where I am. So that kind of ruled out going to any stores. There was a Subway I went to though, where I actually found this beautiful little cove on the eastern end of Lake Ontario. It was like limestone cliffs just outside of Kingston. And it was inaccessible, but I pulled up into this little tiny cove. And I mean like something the size of someone's living room. And then I climbed this cliff. It wasn't hard or anything. I just climbed up through the trees because I saw on my map that there was a Subway right on the other side there. So I had a nice sub that day and brought it back down to the cove and left. And I remember that because I was very hungry and very happy just to have something else in my diet that day. So I probably lost 20 pounds, maybe more. My pants, I know I couldn't keep my pants up. Like they were just, I took my belt in as far as I could and then I was cutting notches and it was like, wow, these pants are like just clearly for someone much larger than me now because they don't fit me at all. And I could feel my ribs. I was so skinny, so hungry. That was one of the hardest mentally of the journey. I was just constantly hungry. So let me do the math in my head. I'm eating about 9 of those bars. They have probably on average about 225 calories a bar. So around 2,000 calories, let's say. Because the other thing, I'm hungry enough that I'm conscious of the fact that this wrapper says there's 230 calories, but I know I'm not getting 230 calories out of it because inevitably there are like crumbs and parts that stick to the inside of the wrapper, and you can try to eat them, you can try to get them, but some of the granola bars are very crumbly and they fall away. Cliff bars aren't like that. You actually get the whole thing out of there. So the bigger bars have like 250. Some of them have 300 calories. Some of the smaller ones, the fruit ones, are a lot less than that. But on average, that's about 2,000 calories just from the bars. And I would eat them almost every hour, right? Like no real breakfast or lunch, but just kind of eat constantly throughout the day. And then the freeze-dried meals, I had 2 different companies, Backpackers Pantry and Alpine Air. They range from a low of about 1,200 calories to a high of about 600 or 1,600 calories if you have like mac and cheese or some of the bigger meals. So, put that together, I would say around 3,000 calories a day. Again, you can't get everything out of the actual package. And inevitably, and this is maybe one of the drawbacks of the freeze-dried meals, they don't, no matter what you do, they don't fully cook. There will always be a little packet in the bottom. It's like, that rice didn't really cook in the, sealed up in there. Or some of it didn't really, fully cook. But anyway, so you would say around 3,000, maybe 3,200 calories a day. And obviously I was burning more than that because I was very hungry. And of course I would want to eat more than that if I could.
Yeah. Wait
a minute. I'm just thinking, I'm doing the math in my head. I think I overestimated. I think I was eating considerably less than that. I think those freeze-dried meals, because it's confusing because they say they serve 2. But I think that they don't double. I think that the calories are actually about 800 in one of those mac and cheeses. So actually more like 2,500 calories.
That's what I thought. But
yes. Yeah. So more like 2,500 calories a day is what I was eating. How much would you eat on one of your canoe journeys?
Well, I'm 220. So I usually 3,500 a day.
Yeah.
But I still lose weight. You're just going for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, and you're cold and you're burning so much heat you're burning so much energy just to keep yourself warm.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point. The last couple of years of doing expeditions, 2020, 2021, 2019, the summers had all been hot. And even though I was at, very far north latitudes, I found that I was sweating half the time. Temperatures would be like 26, 27 degrees. And I'd be like, man, I have all this gear I don't need in terms of wool toques and gloves and winter jackets. And also I have more food than I need, because in this heat, when it's 27 degrees and I'm paddling hard or portaging, I don't really have the appetite I would otherwise. So that was partly what had led me to pack a lot less, to really cut back and just go very, very slim. But then this spring turned out to be unseasonably cold. It was one of the coldest springs in Eastern Canada in decades. Temperatures were consistently 8 to 9 degrees.
West Coast as well.
Yeah, it was 8 to 9 degrees temperatures below. I couldn't believe it. When I was up in northern Quebec and Labrador, it was consistently around 0 degrees at night. There would sometimes be a bit of snow or frost, and daytime temperatures were frequently no more than 8 or 9 degrees Celsius, and it was often rainy on top of that. So that gave me a much greater appetite and really added to the hunger, because as you correctly noted, when you're cold, you feel the calories a lot more. You're always hungry. So that made it a lot harder.
I will say that for the trip I'm leaving for later on this week to the Nahanni, which is basically a downriver run, it's about 4,000 calories a day with a little bit of excess, because you're going downriver. Might as well bring extra food and let the river carry it for you. There's only one portage, so it's not you're not going upriver. You're not have endless portages. I'm going to pig out on that one.
Yeah, and I would do the same if I was in your shoes. And I think that's a good point. I think some people have maybe misinterpreted some of my books and thinks like, oh man, what he has like, what is wrong with this guy? Why wouldn't he want luxuries? And it's like, hey, I enjoy those luxuries as much as anyone. And I do canoe trips for pleasure. If I have a vacation, I'll go paddle around some lakes and just take my time and relax and bring normal food and enjoy cooking it. And I would certainly encourage anyone to do so. It's just, in certain circumstances, in canoeing as in life, you have to travel lighter. So that's just the way it is sometimes.
So what's your advice to people who want to get into whitewater from a expedition point of view? They're not necessarily wanting to go play in rapids, in playboats in a nice controlled setting, but they want to do a trip and they know that there's some whitewater on it. What would be your advice to them?
Well, I would suppose it would depend on the individual and what their background is prior to the expedition. I mean, I would sort of assume that if they're going to do an expedition, they probably already have at least quite a bit of paddling experience. But if for whatever reason they didn't feel comfortable around whitewater rapids, then I would encourage them to acquire some experience and practice before actually going out there. I mean, one of the good things about Canada, at least, and probably the United States as well, no matter where you live, it's unlikely that you are more than a few hours drive from at least some white water. So on a weekend or what have you, you should be able to go out there and actually practice and test things out. I mean, you can bring artificial weight, put whatever you have in your backpack so you get the experience of what it's actually like to paddle a canoe when it has 70, 80, 100, 150 pounds worth of gear in it. It's very different than paddling an empty canoe. So you become more familiar and comfortable with that. And that's one thing you can do. Depends how motivated you are. I mean, if you want to take a course, they have courses in whitewater canoeing. You can sign up and do it that way. You can teach yourself. You can get all sorts of books. And nowadays, you need books. You can watch videos and practice and do all these sorts of things. But yeah, you should probably, I would think that you probably don't want to go and do an expedition in the wilderness with no previous experience of white water. You should probably practice at least a little bit. And I think that as I mentioned, there's lots of accessible rivers all over North America where you can easily do that and just go out and practice, paddle, test out some techniques, that sort of thing. The other good thing is that many expeditions you do, not all of them, but you can often choose a wilderness route where for the first week or so, the water is all relatively novice, and you sort of build up your experience as you go that way as well.
Yeah. What about dealing with medical emergencies, be that from, strains and cuts to more serious, dysentery, beaver fever, malaria, whatever. I mean, we don't have malaria in Canada, but what's your approach, or what would be your advice to dealing with medical issues?
Yeah, this is a difficult one because everyone is different. I mean, you have to almost talk to your doctor and come up with a plan that's right for you because different people have different, obviously, health backgrounds and different risks for different things. But it's definitely, if you're going into a remote area, something everyone should be aware of, especially if you have any sort of prior risk factors, allergies, this sort of thing, right? Like, terrible place to find out that you have an allergy to something in your rations if you're in the middle of nowhere, or anything else for that matter. I mean, I have to say that I've been very lucky in that I've never had any medical issue whatsoever on any journey I've ever done in my entire life. Not one. I've been perfectly fine, perfectly healthy, and I've come home fine from every journey I've ever done. And I think partly that's owing to the mindset of, being careful, being cautious, not taking crazy risks and being reckless. But I will say, just because you did broach the topic, that I frequently have drank untreated water. On my most recent journey, I did it all the time. And in total, I've done it for easily 7 or 8 months of just drinking untreated water. And I've never been sick at all from it. And my mindset sort of evolved on this, right? When I was a kid, my father, when he would take us on canoe trips, he would just drink straight out of the lake, like a lot of people of that generation. I mean, it's completely commonplace. They were just like, oh, it's fine, right? You're out in the wilderness. It's pristine. And then when I was about like 15, and at like 15, I started consuming enormous amounts of survival books. Go to the local library, borrow every book they had on the subject, and just reading as much as I could. And one of the first things you realize when you start reading all the survival books is like the cardinal rule is never drink untreated water, no matter where you are, even if you're in the most isolated mountain range and there's a beautiful glacier. You must assume that it's loaded with parasites and deadly diseases. Never, ever, under any circumstances, drink untreated water. So I remember like confronting my father at 15 and saying, look, it's in all the books. You put my brother and my life in mortal danger because we drank all this untreated water. So from about that age, like through my teenage years and into my early 20s, the pendulum swung the other way, and I did exactly what anyone would who's taught in survival schools or courses that you take, which is always assume every water source is potentially dangerous and treat every water source that you possibly come across. And I did that either through boiling the water or using carbon filter water pumps, right? Which they sell in every outdoor store. And there's obviously a number of ways you can purify water. But that's what I would do. And then in my mid-20s, there was just a couple of expeditions that I did where my water purifier broke. It just broke. And I was really worried, really apprehensive, because it's like, now I have no choice. I will pass out from dehydration much sooner than I will from Giardia or any of these parasites if I try to boil water constantly throughout a canoe trip. It's just not going to happen. So I have no choice. As hesitant as I am, I'm going to have to start drinking untreated water at least some of the time. I'll still boil it at night, fill up my water bottle, my canteen, and try to purify it as much as I can. But inevitably, I'm going to have to compromise here and drink some untreated water. So I did that on a couple of these expeditions in my mid-20s where my thing had broken, and I was fine. I never got sick. And I fully anticipated at the time that I was going to get an upset stomach, at minimum, right? Something would happen to me, but I never did. And this sort of continued where I had a spell of bad luck. I don't know what was up with it, but the first water purifier I bought when I was like 15 and I'd read all those books, it lasted for like 10 years and it was perfect. And I used it thousands of times and I never had an issue with it. Then I had like a string of bad luck where I was buying from the same company. I won't say the company, but I had like 3 or 4 models in a row that snapped or broke. Like sometimes the handle would break off or the filter would break. So I had like multiple expeditions where I had to go almost the whole time drinking untreated water. And I felt like I was playing Russian roulette, right? Like I was still very worried about this. But finally, in my later 20s, when I was getting ready to do my journey across the Arctic, I did a little more research. And I found out that there's actually like peer-reviewed papers where our scientists have gone out and tested the water in the Canadian backcountry. And they're like, well, the risk is actually very low. You would have to have terrible luck or filling up your water like right below a beaver dam or right underneath a caribou herd to actually pick up the parasites and things that are in animal feces. But otherwise, if you use like common sense, you can actually get by just fine drinking mostly untreated water. I mean, I put a lot of caveats in there, right? Still, you want to use common sense. There are definitely places where you could get sick. So then I felt a lot better about it. And now I've gone a lot longer drinking untreated water. Now, I still have to say that literally every day of my journey, I'm still purifying some water. Every night, I would boil at least 3 pots of water, drink 1 pot on the spot, fill up my big water bottle with another pot of purified water, and fill up a thermos that I have, because I'm like, well, I might as well. It's not hard.
Yeah.
I'm going to boil this water. And, on this most recent journey, I wasn't in as remote a place. And of course, there are other potential contaminants from animals, even if you are in a remote spot. So it's like I'm still purifying the water wherever I can, but I'm not as terrified about drinking it untreated because I've done it so often, and I've actually seen now some of the science suggesting that it's hard to quantify a risk, but you're not just going to drop dead if you drink some water from a lake in the middle of the Canadian backcountry. Now, I have a person I know who's the president of a nature club in Ontario. I was staying with him because I was doing a talk for the local nature club. This was in Owen Sound. He told me that he had actually had Giardia twice on canoe trips in Northern Ontario. And I was like, oh man, that's horrible. How did you get it? Was it beavers, moose? What contaminated your drinking water? And he said, no, it wasn't beavers or moose. It was people. It was other people, other campers. And he was of the opinion that was the greatest risk of going places in the Ontario backcountry where lots of other campers are, and they simply have not gone to the bathroom with due diligence. They've done it too close to a water source, and they've contaminated. And that's why he thought he actually got sick from other campers. And of course, I was worried about that on the more populated parts of my route. And I definitely wouldn't drink untreated water out of like Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. I was actually carrying water as much as I could in those places. What is your experience? I'd be curious.
I have met people who've gotten really quite sick, and it's ruined their trips. I mean, Les Stroud is a good example. Mr. Survivor Man, when he got married, I think his honeymoon was like living in a cabin with his wife for, I want to say 9 months. And they spent several months incredibly fatigued and incredibly sick. And if I recall correctly, they had to get airlifted out to get, basically they had beaver fever. They had Giardia. Me, I don't treat. I mean, I'm not going to drink water out of if you're in a little pond with 3 beaver lodges. Okay, I'm just going to wait till the next pond, or I'll boil that water. But on the Nahanni, what's the, or on a large northern river, the volume of water going through there is so gigantic. You would need a whole lot of beavers. You would need a whole lot of caribou. You'd need a whole lot of poop. So Lake Ontario, I'd be worried.
Yes. Well, and there's other things in Lake Ontario too, not just biological things, but just from all the ships and industrial stuff as well.
Yeah, the industrial effluent going directly into the lake.
The other thing you can do, and which I do, is if people are worried about it, because I don't want to come across as like cavalier and give people bad advice, but sometimes what I would do on some of the rivers where I was worried about it, because I know there's mining as well, right, in Labrador, so I was worried potentially about some of the runoff from that. I could see some of it. Is I would still be drinking the water without purifying it, but I would take it from streams coming into the main river. And sometimes there's a couple times where this was really cool, where, I mean, probably a lot of people are familiar with in South America, where you have the famous meeting of the waters with the Amazon. Yeah. And they're 2 totally different colors. And I've seen this many times on Canadian rivers, where you have another river and you can see where the water is joining. One is darker, one is lighter, one is more silty. So several times when I was canoeing some of these rivers on my most recent journey, like the George River and others, I would see a fair-sized creek coming in, and it would be really cool because the water would be a different color where it was coming in. And I would say I'm going to get a drink on the fly because the current was strong. So I'd be zooming along in my canoe, just reach the water bottle over and fill it up in the stream coming in and drink that water. Which is, I know a lot of people do that as well. If they're concerned about, the water that they're on the lake or whatever, find a source, where it's coming out of a stream or something underground water. Yeah.
One interesting place I ran into problems getting drinking water was on the Anderson River. So the Anderson River is flows into the Arctic Ocean. It's a couple rivers over from Tuktoyaktuk.
I've canoed the Anderson River.
Okay, so then you've passed through the Smoking Hills, which is where the shales, these carboniferous shales that have been laid down in the rocks, spontaneously light on fire and just completely pollute the water. So you look up a river, or maybe did you paddle the section? I paddled a section to the coast.
Yep.
Through the tree line. Is that the section you did?
I started on Colville Lake, and I went all the way down to the Beaufort Sea.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like the little creeks and streams coming in to the Anderson would be carrying basically the oxidation products of these smoking, these hills, these just where the soil itself lights on fire. So, okay, we got to go to the left side of the river here, or we got to find another stream coming in from somewhere else. Because we were doing research, so we were exploring. We were exploring from base camps. So we had to be real strategic about where to set up the base camp. Because if you set it up just downstream of one of these basically sources of natural pollution coming in, the water was just horrendous. And I didn't even want to think what we were drinking.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's a lot of diversity out there, which is why I always try to hedge what I'm saying when it comes to drinking water. Because you can't have like sort of one advice fits all. You really have to make a decision based on where you are and know a bit about the area, because there could be natural hazards that people don't anticipate, other hazards. And that's why it's difficult, right? Like if I was writing a survival book, you could see why you just want to say, purify everything, right? Yeah. But then when you get out there, you realize that advice just doesn't work when you have to deal with things like dehydration, or you're not going to be making much progress if you have to purify water constantly throughout every day. It would really slow you down, which is maybe another thing people don't realize. If you've ever used one of those carbon filters, the little pumps, in the advertisements for them, or if you're in a store, it looks really easy. Like you just pump it through and it's remarkably fast. But when you're actually out there, if you're pumping any kind of water that's actually dirty and it's got sediment in it, it's so much harder to pump it through. Yeah. And you frequently have to take it apart and clean the filter. And it becomes increasingly impractical on anything like a long expedition. Like for a short trip where you're doing very short days, then it's like, okay, that can just become a chore that you're going to do multiple times throughout the day. But yeah, it can be difficult. And especially the other factor that you never even really think about until you're out there is the black flies and the mosquitoes.
That's the very next question. So we're going to go, because I think a lot of people refrain from doing expeditions, or if they're thinking about it, that's the main thing they're worried about. We'll start with the bugs. What's your advice to people dealing with bugs?
Yeah, the bugs can be really bad. There's really no way to sugarcoat it, especially at certain times of the year. In June, I was canoeing throughout the month of June, so I had the full onslaught of black flies, and it can be very bad. Even if you have a high tolerance, which I'm blessed with in terms of bug bites, it's still probably the worst aspect. The one really bad aspect is that you just really can't get away from the bugs. Now, fortunately, there's a silver lining in everything, and if it's windy, it doesn't take much wind, but it can completely dispel all of the bugs. I think the only number I've ever heard, someone once said a 5 mile per hour wind is enough to blow them away. And maybe it might be a little more than that, but it doesn't take a whole lot, right? A breeze will get rid of the mosquitoes and the bugs. And that is exactly the sort of thing that I tell myself, right? Okay, they're bad, but by the law of averages, it can't be calm all the time. So sooner or later, the wind is going to pick up and I'll have relief. And the other thing is that smoke is remarkably effective at clearing off bugs. So when you make a campfire, it's amazing how effective the smoke from the campfire is in terms of diminishing the black flies and mosquitoes. They really don't like it. And you don't even have to make like a smoky fire. I'm not talking about like throwing green willows on the fire. Just a normal campfire is usually enough to drive off the bugs. Sometimes if they're really bad, then the campfire doesn't work, but it helps. Other than that, the main thing I do is I don't use a lot of bug spray. And I did a bit of research on this because, this is a whole nother topic of conversation. I don't know if I want to get into this, but I was like one of those people where it's like, I don't really want to be coating myself in DEET. I don't really want to be using a lot of bug spray. So for the most part, I use no bug spray. I didn't pack any bug spray on my recent 3-month journey. Although someone ended up giving me some actually when I was in Labrador, but I was still hesitant to use it because it was like the sunscreen variety that you like smear on. And I was always like, yeah, I don't know what it is. I mean, I'm not paranoid, but I'm like, I really don't want to be rubbing these chemicals all on my skin. And part of the reason why I didn't want to do that is I can't shower, right? I don't have a bathtub or a shower at the end of the day to wash this stuff off. And I don't have a lot of extra clothing. So inevitably I'm going to have this stuff on me for like a month, and it's just going to be getting coated more and more. And even the best bug spray does not work very long. Like usually it says on the package, it will give you protection for 4 hours or 5 hours. But in my experience, it works for like 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And then the hordes of black flies and mosquitoes just come back. So you have to use an enormous quantity of this stuff to actually get much effect out of it. Now, that said, and I'm no expert, so don't give any weight to what I'm about to say. Everyone do their own research. Apparently, if you do the research, they say that DEET is like one of the safest of all products out there, that it's been tested extensively and it's been on the market for like 50 years, and they've tested it even on pregnant women, and it's supposed to be extremely safe. Again, I know nothing about this subject, so my opinion is worthless. I'm just relaying this information. Sure. I still take it with a grain of salt, and I still don't really use this stuff. I just wear long sleeves and long pants, and I tuck them in. Most of the time, it's cool enough that that's not really an issue. And at the end of the day, as I just explained, even the best bug spray is not that effective in northern Canada. In southern Canada, perhaps, but in northern Canada, it's not. So I would just rather wear long pants and long shirts anyways. It's the most effective thing. And I wear a mesh bug net. So that's what I rely upon. What do you do?
Mesh bug net.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although it was a few years ago now, but coming up through Newton Lake, the bugs had been so terrible on the Cochrane River, and I hadn't brought bug spray. I just brought the net, that when I came across the ruins of Newton Lake Lodge, which is this giant fishing lodge, which had just been abandoned out there in the wilderness, and I was exploring it and going into the workshop, there was a can of Muscal, kind of bug spray. It's like, I'm taking that. my principles on not using bug spray straight out the window. Like, and it came in useful a few times.
Yeah, and I've been the exact same way. On my journey alone across the Arctic, I packed like one thing of bug spray, and I treated it as like an emergency supply, like something in my first aid kit, which is like, I'm not going to use bug spray, but when it's like to the absolute breaking point, then I'll pull this out and give myself a douse. And I described it in my book, Beyond the Trees, that moment when I used it, because I felt like I was actually getting woozy, because you can get sick if you get enough black fly bites where your throat will swell up. And I was starting to get to that point. I mean, I have some absolutely horrendous photos of what it looks like to just be eaten alive day after day by like huge clouds of black flies. And it can be bad. And sometimes you have to use it. You have no choice. But again, it's not like the temptation would be greater if it actually like gave you 100% protection and it would last all day, but it never does. And then you just have to keep reapplying it to get the result.
What kind of bug mesh do you use? Do you just use it to protect your head, or the full-on shirt with the zipper across the mouth?
Yeah, I just have the ordinary like $2 one that you get from the store. Like I know they make the full shirts, which are undoubtedly better, but I don't use those. I just use the net over my head. That's it. Do you have the full shirt?
The full shirt is a thing of beauty. The problem is the mesh that goes down the arms. When you're portaging, inevitably those get ripped. So all of a sudden you're walking along. It's like, why is my stomach covered in blood? It's like, oh, before you look, I must have torn open the mesh on the armpit, and they found that one hole, that one hole that's the size of a penny, and just comes lined up and comes streaming in there. But so you've got one more job to do that night, which is to sew it up. Bears. This is the kind of go-to bugaboo for people talking about the North. You're about to set off on a journey. They don't say, be careful on those big lakes. They don't say, be careful of the cold water. They say, be careful of the bears. Take a shotgun. You know what? Take 2 shotguns. So the bears feature is very, very large in the imaginary of people, of the terrible things that can happen to you in the bush. What's your advice to people about bears?
Well, it's a bit like the other hazards that we've talked about, which is it's hard to give one size fits all advice because circumstances can vary depending on where you're going and what you're doing. But if you were to ask me to come up with my list of like the top 10 hazards that I worry about, bears would definitely not be in the top 5. And if they make the top 10 at all, they would be at the very like bottom, just barely crack the top 10. Like I worry 100 times more about the weather, lightning. I had numerous lightning storms on my most recent journey. I worry way more about the wind. Wind is just, it can be terrifying. Not only on the water when you're paddling, but I've camped in many places where there's a significant hazard that a tree could fall on my tent in the night, and there's nothing you can do about it because it's like deadfall everywhere for hundreds of miles in all directions in Labrador, and a tree could fall over and crush you, or at least seriously injure you in the night. So wind, weather, those are things that I really worry about. Hypothermia, cold water, rapids, other things, just freak accident, slipping and smashing your head off a rock because you slipped in a boulder field doing a portage, or anything like that. I mean, any sort of unforeseen medical emergency. I worry about those sorts of things far more than I would about bears. In my experience, the vast, vast majority of bears are shy, and most of them, they'll run away as soon as you see you. Some that don't, if you make any sort of threatening gesture or noise, then they'll run away. And yes, of course, there are aggressive bears, and they're certainly capable of killing and attacking humans. But it's kind of like any risk factor, right? It'd be like, are you terrified of, walking down the street of Toronto or Vancouver at night? Well, I mean, statistically, yes, every year people do get attacked, murdered, any number of bad things could happen to them, but the risk is very low, and it doesn't really make sense to be completely worried about that when there are so many other things that could get you, right? Everyday hazards that we don't really think about, that we're cavalier about. So, of course, you don't want to be completely dismissive of the risk, but it's relatively low down the list.
Did your risk calculus change at all in Ungava Bay? Because now you're talking polar bears.
Yeah, so there were polar bears there. And, I'd be lying if I said they didn't make me nervous. They do. And I have a recurrent nightmare of a polar bear swimming under my canoe. This is partly because the water on almost all those northern rivers, not all of them, but the majority, is very clear. So you can see far down into the lake. And polar bears, of course, are excellent swimmers. I mean, they can swim faster than anyone can paddle a canoe. And sometimes I would see this huge white thing right underneath my canoe. And you would have like a moment of terror, and you think that's a polar bear because they swim underwater. I mean, they're a marine animal, right? Yeah. They live the vast majority of their lives on the water, frozen water, but on the water nonetheless. So I would think that's a polar bear. But what inevitably it is, there'd be these giant boulders, white boulders, like all white boulders lying on the bottom of the water. The river or the coast, and it would look exactly like a polar bear through the distortion of the sky and the water underneath as you're paddling. And it's terrifying because, let's face it, if there actually was a polar bear under your canoe, you would have very few options. There'd be very little you could do about it if that polar bear intended harm. Yeah, I mean, you'd be essentially a sitting duck. Yeah. Even if the polar bear didn't eat you, if it so much as flipped your canoe, you'd be in serious trouble. So that's like a nightmare that I always have, that I'm going to see a polar bear underneath the water. Now, strangely enough, I wasn't really worried at the time because I was just sort of under the impression that even though I was theoretically, if you look up the range of a polar bear, I was within the range of polar bears. I just thought there wasn't going to be any around. I figured, this early in the year in July, polar bears are still offshore. They're out on the ice floes hunting seals. I doubt any of them will be hanging around on the coast here or coming inland, even less so. So it didn't really trouble my thought at all. And I didn't think too much about it. I mean, I took all the same precautions I normally would around black bears and things, but I slept perfectly fine. And then when I actually reached the end of my journey, I came to a little tiny Inuit community called Kangasolajak. And when I coasted into shore there, it felt a little bit surreal. 3,400 kilometers, 90 days. And I come into shore there. And the first person I meet, this guy who I learned his name, Willie, and he's a local man there, Willie. And almost the first thing he says to me is that there were 2 polar bears swimming upriver, exactly where I just came downriver. So on a perfect collision course. And I was like, whoa, really? Like, I didn't think there were any polar bears. And he's like, well, yeah, all the ice is melted out on Ungava Bay. So there's no ice. So when the ice melts, they all go upriver to try to catch salmon. And I'm like, whoa, I'm really glad that I didn't know that at the time, because I wouldn't have slept a wink if I'd known that I just passed 2 polar bears coming downriver as I was going upriver.
They're probably under your canoe.
Yeah, well,
maybe those weren't white rocks.
Yeah, so he said they had just seen them, and of course I wanted to interrogate him and know everything about it. He said it was like I think a few days earlier, which was even more terror-inducing, because that's like, yeah, definitely I was right on a collision course with them, but I didn't see them, which is maybe, ignorance is bliss, so I didn't have to be terrified about it. But that definitely made me reconsider everything, where I thought, like, yeah, there aren't any real polar bears around, but then it turns out actually there are. And then, of course, I had to ask him every polar bear story he had. He told me about someone who lived in the village who'd been attacked by a polar bear. She survived, luckily. But, I mean, even so, as maybe my example just demonstrates, it's not like, well, there's a polar bear, so you're definitely going to get eaten. Those bears paid no attention to me whatsoever, and I was fine.
Yeah.
But it's just such a difficult subject, really.
Yeah, I think polar bears are a different world from black bears and grizzly bears. I mean, there's lots of Inuit who are happy to camp inland in canvas tents when they're hunting caribou in the middle of winter, and that's perfectly normal. But you're not going to find very many Inuit, I'm going to go out on a limb and say none, who feel comfortable camping on the Hudson Bay coast in the summer, like in a tent. They just don't do it. And it's because of polar bears. That strip along the coast there is polar bear central. So they're happy to camp inland. They're happy, canvas tents, no problem. In the winter when all the bears are out on the ice anyway. But I think polar bears are just an entirely different. Well, they are an entirely different animal, but their ecology of being 100% carnivorous, or I think Wikipedia describes them as hypercarnivorous the last time I looked. That phrase scares me, hypercarnivorous. So I think that's worth carrying a 12 gauge and carrying one of those bear perimeter fences, those little alarms that you can stretch a monofilament line around your tent.
And they're also massive compared to black bears. So if you do meet with one, your odds of defending yourself are dramatically lower. Like, if you look at black bear attacks, humans have a surprisingly high success rate of successfully defending themselves. Like, just a little bit of fight oftentimes is enough to make a black bear leave. But your odds would not be good at all, like almost zero, you would think. The one example that Willie told me, the only reason the woman survived is her husband was there and killed the bear with a gun. That was the only reason. So, your odds of actually fighting one off with a knife or something, as has been done with black bears, would be very low.
Yeah, a dinner table with gigantic teeth. Okay, next question. We got a couple more left here. Your advice for rain and cold weather gear. We kind of touched on this earlier, but you were going super minimalist, so you would just actually strip down when you're dealing in the cold water,
right?
But certainly hypothermia is probably on your top 5 list of things to worry about.
Yeah, it is. I had hypothermia a lot when I was doing expeditions on a shoestring budget in my 20s, and I've never had hypothermia since then because I have better clothing. And I mean, just something as simple as merino wool, like a merino wool base layer, it really diminishes the chances that you're going to have hypothermia in summer canoeing, because, I mean, it's just so effective at keeping you warm even when you're wet. But if you don't have that, and I didn't have it on any of my early expeditions, then hypothermia becomes almost inevitable in a place like Hudson Bay, where I often would paddle and it would be wet and windy. You would constantly be plagued by it. But no, I was mostly fine, and I experimented, as I said, with just doing things the old-fashioned way, which is, I'm not going to use neoprene or any sort of waterproof system. I'm literally just going to wear like ordinary summer wading shoes, as if you were a kid at summer camp or going to a beach, to protect my feet from sharp rocks and walk through the water and get wet, because I felt like I'm moving and the movement is keeping me warm. And then as soon as I'm done, like, this was when I was wading through rapids, right? Like down the side of them and stuff. I felt like it would be an asset because inevitably any of those systems you wear are quite awkward and bulky. And I was like, just being light and having these really good wading shoes that I think they were actually like kind of a hiking style will make me much more agile in terms of actually moving through here. And it did. And I was fine because as soon as I was done, I would just take them off and get back into my canoe and change back into dry clothing. And because also I was fairly confident that the temperatures wouldn't be that cold. Like if I was doing it in September or even earlier in the year, then I wouldn't have done that system. But because I knew it was like July, I wasn't overly concerned about it. I definitely wouldn't do that in September. That would be miserable. But at that time of year, I felt that option would be fine. And it seemed to work well for me. I did have an interesting revelation, though, about waterproof jackets and things, which is a friend of mine who's a lot older than me. He's an American who I've done a number of canoe trips with. He actually had mentioned to me that he didn't really believe full-heartedly in Gore-Tex and like the modern synthetics, that he was a bit of a skeptic and thought that nothing but an old-fashioned like sort of fisherman's rubber rain jacket was the only thing that would keep you dry in the heaviest downpours. And when he had said that to me like 5 years ago, I was like, oh no, but everyone in the outdoor industry, they're using all the flashy brands, the best brands with their high-tech, modern, cutting-edge waterproof gear. So I sort of dismissed it as sort of like an old-fashioned opinion that had surely been debunked and discredited. But I discovered on this journey that no, that's absolutely correct. That I had a brand new rain jacket from a very reputable, famous outdoor company. And I found that in those heavy downpours, because I said it was like, some of the heaviest rain on record in recent memory, it soaked right through. It did nothing. And that was what I found. It was like, yeah, but this might look great in like some sort of YouTube video or advertisement when you're spraying it with a garden hose in a test. But it's like, if you're paddling for 15 hours a day and it's heavy rain, it's going through, it's soaking through. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was like, this is just garbage. How is this happening to my modern rain jacket? So I was like, maybe it's a fluke. Maybe it's just something has gone wrong here. So I actually, since I was still on the Great Lakes, I had, when I made camp, asked my wife to go to the outdoor store, buy the best rain jacket they sell in that store. I said, I don't care what the price is, buy it and mail it to me, and I'll get it at my next Canada Post stop, which was in a week or two. And she did. And when I got it, I thought at first, oh, this is amazing. It's keeping me dry. But it was the same experience. I again experienced incredibly heavy rain in May in Quebec, and it soaked right through.
Was there condensation from all the paddling just overwhelming the breathability of the garment?
No, it wasn't condensation. It was cold, and it was just heavy rain was more than it could bear in the arms, especially. It would soak through in the arms. And it was just, and so I actually ended up reading, and I found that, some people who write reviews had been wise to this fact. I think they use the expression, what do they say? They have some sort of expression, they call it wetting through or something. And they said essentially any modern fabric will do this. Especially if you're using just basically a windbreaker, right? Like the really thin, it's not insulated. There's not multiple layers. I find that if I use like a thicker jacket from any of those same companies, then it works because it has like multiple layers. Yeah. But any of those thin ones, if you're in heavy rain for long enough, it's going to soak through. So I was actually converted through that experience to my friend's view of things, which is that actually at the end of the day, only the old-fashioned rubber sort of raincoats is the only thing that's actually going to keep you bone dry in the heaviest of downpours. And I would be interested to see what other people's experiences are, but from the bit of research that I did, I found that for people who actually are doing like field tests where you're not just testing it for like an afternoon or a weekend, but you're actually going on like a multiple month-long expedition, and you're experiencing very heavy rain, eventually it's going to soak right through. And I found that with any of those products, any Gore-Tex, eventually it'll soak through. That's what I found. Has that been your experience? But you have to have you have to have real heavy rain.
Certainly on the lighter, like the single layer windbreaker, 100% yes. With the, I'll name drop it, even though I paid full price for it and they didn't give me a bloody discount. Thank you very much, Arc'teryx. The Arc'teryx severe weather stuff that's quite thick and quite heavy, I've not had it leak through.
No, and I haven't either. Not for the heavy stuff. Like all the heavy stuff that I've used, that does keep you dry, at least for a while. Like eventually, if you use your stuff for years, it'll start to wear through.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And I think they've got a pretty good replacement. I can't believe I'm pimping Arc'teryx for free. I think they've got a pretty good replacement policy as well. You can say like, hey, I bought this for jacket for $600 or whatever the crazy number is 3 years ago and 4 years ago, and it's now leaking. I think they'll replace it. We'll find out soon enough if that's not correct. Next issue, navigation. What's your number one piece of advice to people for navigating, especially in the complex lakes and to some extent rivers of the Canadian North? Not the George River, which you said was a straight run.
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge asset if you can learn to navigate intuitively, doing things the old-fashioned way that humans have done for thousands of years everywhere humans have ever lived, which is just reading the landscape and using the sun. This might sound incredibly daunting, like, but it would take a lifetime to acquire such skills. But in reality, it's actually relatively straightforward and something that I think almost anyone could master. And you can get decent at it in a relatively short amount of time, weeks or maybe a month, just to get the rudimentary aspect down. But I think the more you can navigate intuitively, just looking at the rivers and getting a real sense of reading them, right? Like you've studied the map before you left home. Yeah. And now that mental image of the map in your mind, you're able to transfer it seamlessly to what you're actually looking at. So you don't have to consult it every 10 minutes. That is a huge asset. And it can make not only your paddling much more enjoyable because you don't have to constantly fiddle with a GPS or a map. It allows you to cover a vastly greater distance than someone who has to constantly wait for a GPS to power up, especially out there, right, where there's no cell towers. GPS isn't instantaneous. It takes a while to turn on, to connect to a satellite and bring up a map. And of course, the other problem is, you often have glare from the sun, just making it hard to see the screen. You have to take your polarized sunglasses off and the waves are knocking you around. And then the actual screen is really small. So you're left with either you got to zoom in all the way to get to the sense of where you are, but now you can't see your surroundings, this big 30-kilometer lake that you're on. So then you try to zoom out, but then you can't really tell where you are. So I think that learning to navigate the way that humans have for countless generations is something that's not only a lot of fun, but it's intensely practical. It will help you in countless ways on any sort of canoe trip or journey. And you do that just by spending more and more time out in nature, navigating in the woods. It can be a challenge. I was lucky. I got to grow up with a forest all around my house, and the forest had no trails. It was just a wild forest, right? And I just took it for granted that every day I was in the woods with my brother and my dog, and we just wandered at will. And we got really good at memorizing things in the woods. That particular sassafras, that particular oak.
And you made it home. You made it home eventually.
Yes. And then just naturally it evolves from that. Every canoe trip you do, you get very used to memorizing the landscape. So you always remember where you've come from. And it just happens very easily, right? And I think anyone can master that without too much trouble. And it will help you a lot when you're navigating. And again, it's not...
Sorry, that natural navigation also helps provide sort of a second opinion, because maps can be incorrect, GPS can be incorrect.
Yep. Yeah, that my GPS was wrong a few times in Labrador just because landscapes change. Actually, beavers change it. It was showing a water course connecting these lakes. And I'm not talking like a little beaver creek. It was showing it was all part of a lake, but the lake no longer existed. Decades ago, it must have been, the beavers had built dams, and over time, dams can become solid. And these dams had trees, tamaracks and spruce and willows and alders that had grown on them, and rocks had accumulated, and then sediment had accumulated. So the landscape was just nothing like the GPS. It had become completely different over time. Now, I'm saying, I don't want to say that you shouldn't use a GPS. Of course you should use a GPS. I use a GPS. I carry them on my expeditions, and I carry topographic maps and compass. You should use all of them. It's
Yeah.
kind of like the natural navigating intuitively works hand in glove with the
Yeah.
GPS, because now you don't need to check your GPS as often, right? If you didn't have
Yeah.
any sort of natural navigation ability, then you would have to check your GPS like every half hour, maybe even more frequently if you're portaging or something. But if you're comfortable, bushwhacking for 2 kilometers and you're sure that you're not going around in circles, that you're keeping an even course, wow, your portage just got a lot easier than, especially with storms of black flies around you, checking your GPS to make sure you're going the right way. And in some ways, if you become dependent on the GPS, it's going to make your task infinitely harder, because now it's like you've got to follow this screen to find where I left my backpack, because I've got to get my next load for this portage. But the forest, there's no trails, and you're going to constantly stumble over boulders, over deadfall, falling down trees, all sorts of hummocks and other natural objects or obstacles. So it actually makes it a lot harder relying on something like that. So I would say that in terms of navigating, learning to do a little bit the old-fashioned way can go a long way to making things easier and more enjoyable.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And at the same time, the GPS has been a lifesaver on portages. When a forest fire has gone through and a whole bunch of jack pine has come up and it's all 15 feet high for as far as the eye can see, and it's super dense, like there's no... you can tell which direction is north, which direction is south from the sun, and that's about it. So using the GPS in a situation like that is a godsend. Otherwise it would totally change the way that you portage. You would have to do it in like jumps of 50 feet or 100 feet, because you will lose your backpack in that unending sea of essentially homogeneity.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's but your GPSs fail, batteries run out, screens get cracked, and if that's the only way you have of navigating, you can really screw yourself hard that way too.
Yep. And just it'll take you so much longer to navigate through lakes and things if you need your GPS to do it for you. But my whole advice is that you use both, right? That I'm saying the GPS and the old-fashioned way, hand in hand, combine them, and you have the best of all possible worlds.
Something that's not really possible for you or for any longer trip is if you, like the screen display on most GPSs sucks, but if you link it to your phone, the display of the GPS on the phone is usually a lot better. However, now you're burning your batteries on your GPS much faster because it has to talk to your phone. You're burning batteries on your phone much faster because it has to be talking to your GPS. So it's not really sustainable for, on the scale of a week trip or a 2-week trip or a 3-month trip at all.
No, yeah, that would be a challenge.
Second last question. Trip planning. What's your advice for trip planning? I mean, you're a huge researcher. That comes across in your books very, very clearly. What advice would you give to people who are planning, I don't know, they're planning to do a trip in XYZ area, and what resources would you suggest and what process would you suggest that they do before they go?
Well, sort of the theme and how I've been answering a lot of these questions is variety. So I do like to do both. Yeah, a lot of the expeditions I do, especially if it's an official one for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, then I like to research it as meticulously and as extensively as possible, and basically leave no stone unturned in my quest for every scrap of information I can possibly turn up relevant to the area I'm going to and the history of that place. But there's something to be said also for old-fashioned adventure and doing trips more spontaneously as well. Especially if you were doing it to have fun, then there is nothing wrong in certain circumstances with, I never heard about this place until Thursday, and it's come across my desk. I'm super excited. I'm leaving the office, taking tomorrow off, calling in sick or whatever, grabbing my backpack and going out there. I don't know much about it, but, I'm kind of under the spell, and I want to get out in those mountains and just go out there and enjoy it the old-fashioned way. And it'll be, in some ways, a more pleasurable experience when everything is new and I don't know anything about it. And it's exciting coming to this place. Now, obviously, it would be, I mean, I'm sort of, with that example, I'm inclining towards like a local park you didn't know about or something, right? Like an hour's drive from where you live. I'm not talking about all of a sudden getting on a helicopter and flying to Ellesmere Island. That would be a little bit
Sure.
riskier. But I like to do both those things, right?
Greenland without a plan.
Yeah, just drop me in the interior on the ice cap with this one backpack. Yeah, that would be crazy. But I mean, I like to do both, you know, the more spontaneous adventures and the ones that take years of planning. But we'll go with the planning ones because that was more your question. And I think, yeah, if you're going to do an expedition, any sort of wilderness travel, it pays off to do your homework, right? Do as much research as you can on the area you're going into. Now, I like history and I like writing about history. I did it in my book, History Canada in 10 Maps. And that's not a bad place to start if you're going to a river, let's say. Most of the famous rivers in Canada, you can find a published book on, often a very old book that might have been published 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But thanks to the internet, it's easier than ever to obtain these. Many of them are literally online for free, digitized. And they can be an excellent source of information as a starting point. Like the George River, we've mentioned that a few times. Well, there's books that were written on canoeing the George River 100 years ago that still have a lot of useful information in them. And you could start by reading that and then work your way chronologically all the way up through the decades, 1940s, 70s, all the way up to 2022, using the internet, using your library. If you have access to a university library, they often have a wealth of information on exploration and all sorts of different fields that's hard to get your hands on otherwise, because a lot of it hasn't been digitized, like Geological Survey of Canada files and other files like that often have a lot of really rich information on the land, the geography, the routes. So you can research it in all those countless ways. Of course, a lot of the research is done nowadays on a laptop, looking at Google Earth, zooming in carefully and studying what you're actually seeing there. And the more you practice that, the more you can read from the satellite. You can get a good sense of what the landscape is going to be like. Like there's a lot of beaches and sand dunes along this river, or that, actually might not be a sandy coastline. That's actually rock, just sort of looks like it because it's a light colored rock. So you get a sense just from doing that. All of that will help a person planning any sort of route. And of course, there's more specific information. If you really want to start making phone calls and tracking people down, you can find people who've been in the area, reach out to them any way you can, and getting information out of them. So yeah, all of those things are relevant to it.
All right. Final question. I'm sure you get this a lot, specifically with regards to traveling alone, so solo traveling. What would you tell people about loneliness, people who are worried about getting out there and being lonely?
Well, it depends on the nature of the journey that you're doing. If your journey is a very physically demanding undertaking, you probably won't have to worry about loneliness at all, because every minute that you're awake, you'll be consumed by the task. Because when you're alone, there's no division of labor. You can't have one person go fetch water, the other person get the tent up, another person chop firewood. You can't even take for granted having one person in the bow of the canoe look at the GPS or the map while the other guy paddles. Every moment of the day, you essentially have a task in front of you, right? It can be a challenge if you do have to look at a map. It's another reason why to get good at navigating intuitively. If the wind is against you or the current is against you, even looking at a map can be a challenge, because I use the expression, you can't take your hands off the wheel, being your paddle. You need two hands on that paddle at all times. Even just getting a drink of water is a challenge now, right? If you set down your paddle, the wind is going to blow you where you don't want to go. It's going to blow you into the shore. Or often in northern Canada, it can be hard to find a landing spot for a canoe. The shoreline might be nothing but alders and willows, and it's like a swamp, like a mangrove swamp almost of the north. Or it could be cliffs, or it could be mud flats. It could be hard to get in there. So, even just going to shore for some routine task is a pretty big undertaking. So almost from the moment you wake up and you have to start packing up your sleeping bag, rolling up your clothes, taking down your tent, portaging everything back down to the lakeshore, to the moment that you hit the sleeping bag at night, you will be busy. So you don't really have time for the loneliness. Now, there are circumstances like where I described being windbound, where the wind has forced you on shore. And now you have all the time in the world, the minutes drag. That's when maybe people will start to experience loneliness. But there's definitely a cure for that. And it's the oldest one in the book, which is bring something to read. One of my favorite adventure stories is Joshua Slocum, who was the Nova Scotia sailor. He was the first person ever to sail alone around the world. He did it back in the 1890s. And
Really?
he wrote a fabulous book about it called Sailing Alone Around the World. And it took him close to 3 years to do it. And he wasn't really in a rush. He just did it. He was an old sailor, and the age of sail had ended, and steamboats had come to the fore. And he said, I'm going to build my ship and sail alone around the world. And in his book, he talks about loneliness, and loneliness of the most extreme sort, where he's on a boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And he famously wrote, he said that his books were ever his friends, that he found that it wasn't good to be alone, but when he had his books, he was no longer alone because his books were always his friends. And I definitely can relate to that feeling on my journeys, just having a book I really enjoy, getting to read it. It's like a chocolate bar or something. It's such a nice feeling, like, oh yeah, I'm windbound, which is too bad, but I'm going to make a nice little fire, have a cup of tea, and really, dive into this nice little book, and then I don't really feel lonely here. Of course, the other thing you can do is stay active. I'm always busy taking notes. I'm going to go look at these plants, lichens, see what I can find, look at the trees, look at the wildlife. All these things sort of dispel any feeling of loneliness when you're active and engaged, which is another reason why I think anyone who's traveling in wild places should, maybe pack a field guide to the birds or to the plants. And if you have a field guide, all of a sudden, you don't have time to be lonely, because it's like, oh man, I figured out what this flower is, or I figured out what this bird is that I keep seeing. And, it adds another dimension to the journey, and it makes it more rewarding.
Okay. Well, thank you for those questions. That's quite an extensive series of questions and even more extensive answers. What people who just listened to you or being introduced to you for the first time, they probably have a lot of faith in your adventuring and exploration and canoeing credentials by this point, but they won't have any proof of your writing credentials, and you are a really good writer. So let's go through the books that you've written. Let's go through your website. Let's go through your social media, just so people can find out more. I've really enjoyed all the books of yours that I've read. I think there are a couple still that I have to track down. You keep on telling me A Whisper on the Night Wind. I have to read it. We've tried to get it to me a couple of times. That has failed. I'm going to get it. I will read it as soon as I'm back in September. So Whisper on the Night Wind, that's your most recent one.
Yes, The Whisper on the Night Wind is my most recent book. It's a canoe adventure in Labrador, and actually a mystery. So it's great for anyone who likes mystery. The whole mystery was about a ghost town, a place that was abandoned 100 years ago, and strange tracks in the woods. So it's kind of a cold case, and I wrote the book like a detective story, like Sherlock Holmes. And the whole fun of the book is trying to unravel the mystery before you get to the end, because I give lots of clues throughout the book, and I reproduce the fur trappers' diaries, the eyewitness accounts from 100 years ago. I let the reader read their actual words, and buried in their diaries and journals are all the clues you need to decipher the mystery. And by the time you get to the end, you learn what the answer to this century-old mystery is. And so it's a fun book. It's a great book for a campfire or a trip. And that's The Whisper on the Night Wind. That's my most recent book, which just came out last year. I also have a history book called The History of Canada in 10 Maps, which, despite the title, is not really about maps at all. It's about the flesh and blood characters who created the maps, bringing them to life, and telling tales from Canada's history. And my book, Beyond the Trees, is about my journey alone across Canada's Arctic. And then my first book is Alone Against the North, and that's about surviving adventures in Canada's wilderness alone. So, yeah. And you can find those books pretty much anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Indigo Chapters, Kohl's, independent bookstores, what have you. If you go to my website, there's links there to order them. But yeah, you can find them online.
Yeah. Well, I've enjoyed everything that I've read of yours so far, and I look forward to continuing to enjoy them when I get my hands on Whisper on the Night Wind soon.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. All right, Adam. Everybody's going to ask this. I'm sorry for asking this. You've just finished some giant bloody expedition, and of course, the final question is usually, "What's next?" And I'm sorry that you're probably just enjoying putting on body weight and spending time with your family. But do you have any inkling what's next?
Oh yes, I was already planning new expeditions before I even finished
okay.
the last one. I have enough to last the rest of this decade and into the 2030s, more than I'll ever be able to actually undertake. Actually, I'm really excited for some big historical expedition that I want to do, focusing more on my academic side, archaeology. And I can't give too much away about it because it's still hypothetical in the future, but I envision it as a multi-year project, kind of an ongoing research project. And I'm really excited about it. It involves historical geography, I'll say, and using old maps and telling the stories behind them and sort of investigating some of these historic maps from centuries ago in Canada. So I'm really excited about that. I'll have updates about that on my Instagram and Facebook and my website as we get closer to it.
Your Instagram would be Adam_Shoalts, if I recall correctly?
Yeah, it's just my name.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you again, and good luck with everything that's coming at you in the future.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks.